Tolkien didn't really plan things out when he wrote. From 1937 to 1954, he worked on The Lord of the Rings, and as one might imagine, his vision changed over time. There were immense changes to characters, places, and the entire plot, and some of the earliest versions of those things are entirely unrecognizable. One character that benefited immensely from changes, or rather, Tolkien not following through on his plans, was Boromir. So in this video, we look at Boromir's terrible original fate. By late 1939, Tolkien had made significant progress on what would become the Fellowship of the Ring. While he would continue to change things, the plot and the characters were mostly recognizable up until the Council of Elrond chapter. By this point, the events that occur in Moria had also been initially drafted, so the furthest point that Tolkien's story had reached was what occurred in Lothlorien. In a note that Christopher Tolkien tentatively dates to August 1939, Tolkien wrote a rough outline that would detail the remainder of the plot, not just for the Fellowship of the Ring, but for the whole story. Interestingly, he had it separated as two narrative paths, one for Frodo and Sam, and one for the rest of the Fellowship, and this is how it would remain 15 years later. And as you might expect, it's almost completely unrecognizable. There's only really a few things in Tolkien's plot outline that are remotely similar to what he eventually ended up writing. For example, Merry and Pippin still meet Treebeard, but he's a giant at this point because Ents haven't been conceptualized. There is still a siege of Minas Tirith, but it occurs much sooner because the Rohan plot just doesn't exist at this point. Gandalf still lays the verbal smackdown on Saruman at Isengard, but Saruman's role in the story isn't the same. There's no Ents, and Gandalf breaks his staff with his knee, instead of with magic, which is absolutely hilarious. And while Frodo, Sam, and Bilbo do set sail into the west, at one point, Tolkien writes down that they set sail to Greenland, possibly for national security purposes. However, Christopher does later correct this to a Green Land. Boromir's role in the story is very different as well, and he actually survives beyond the point that he does in the actual story, because there's no attack at Amon Hen. But this isn't really a good thing because Boromir's fate in Tolkien's outline is actually far worse, because instead of doing something evil and then redeeming himself, Boromir instead does something evil, doubles down, and gets worse and worse throughout the story, before dying without any form of redemption. Okay, so what happens? Well, something similar happens in that Boromir does attempt to take the One Ring from Frodo a few days after the Fellowship leaves Lothlorien. In the actual story, Boromir says that he grew angry, which causes Frodo to flee. The Fellowship splits up to look for Frodo, Saruman's orcs attack, and Boromir redeems himself by heroically defending Merry and Pippin. They are captured, Boromir is mortally wounded, and then dies in Aragorn's arms after confessing that he tried to take the One Ring. This is something of a redemption, at least. In the outline, Boromir just lies. He says that Frodo has climbed a tree and will be back soon, but when Frodo is not back soon, everyone starts looking for him. Because everyone took too long to start searching, Frodo is long gone. This causes the Fellowship to split without any interference. Merry and Pippin get lost during the search and end up in Fangorn, while Sam searches alone and does eventually catch up to Frodo because he's able to follow Gollum. Tolkien briefly played with the idea of Legolas and Gimli being captured by Saruman, but instead has them decide to abandon the quest and return north to their homelands. As for Aragorn and Boromir, they decide to go straight to Minas Tirith. Aragorn is already suspicious of Boromir at this point because Boromir has little desire to search for Frodo and wants to immediately go home. But it gets worse. Thanks to having been corrupted by the One Ring, and then doubling down on a shameful act, Boromir gradually succumbs to evil. While he and Aragorn are in Minas Tirith, the city is besieged by Sauron's forces. Perhaps early in the siege, the unnamed Lord of Minas Tirith is killed, and the people of the city select Aragorn as their leader instead of Boromir. Boromir, consumed by jealousy and rage, deserts the defense and sneaks off to Saruman in order to get his aid to take back the lordship. It's worth noting that Saruman is actually taking part in the siege of Minas Tirith because the whole Rohan plotline doesn't exist. The siege of the city is then broken by Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, and Treebeard. We don't know much about the battle except that Tolkien doesn't want it to be overly large because he still envisioned a greater battle taking place beneath Mount Doom at this point. Gandalf is said to have had a contest with Saruman, who flees and shuts himself in Isengard. Gandalf then drives back the Black Riders and retakes Osgiliath to secure the crossing of the Anduin. Boromir is not mentioned anywhere else in the battle. The note ends shortly afterwards, but not without Tolkien posing to himself the question of what becomes of Boromir. Tolkien asks himself the question, does Boromir repent? Unfortunately, the answer is no, as Tolkien later wrote that Boromir is to be slain by Aragorn. When and where, we have no idea. But as you can see, Tolkien did not envision a noble end for the Boromir character at first, and Christopher, when examining these notes, wondered if Boromir's treachery and then him running off to Saruman was an inspiration for the Grima Wormtongue character. Tolkien didn't immediately continue writing the story because in 1940 he decided to expand Saruman's role in the tale, which required rewrites of the Fellowship of the Ring. But by late 1941 he had made significant progress on the chapters between Lothlorien and the Breaking of the Fellowship. By this point, Boromir has undergone some changes. He obviously still attempts to take the One Ring from Frodo, and although he is somewhat remorseful, he does still not admit responsibility to the rest of the Fellowship, saying only that he had seen Frodo, and he actually puts some blame on Frodo for vanishing. At some point, while Tolkien was writing these chapters, he wrote down the number of future chapters and posed questions for himself that he had to answer. In chapter 23, he writes the note, Treachery of Boromir. But finally, that version of Boromir died altogether. While writing The Breaking of the Fellowship, Tolkien wrote notes that the reason the Fellowship should break is that the orcs would attack, and Boromir would be killed. The evil Boromir plotline had been abandoned. Afterwards, it's clear Tolkien tried to make Boromir a more sympathetic character, both within the story and to the reader. He decided to change some of Boromir's interactions. His apology to Frodo after he attempts to take the One Ring is longer. When he returns to the others, he does admit that he got angry and that's the reason why Frodo ran away. He's clearly ashamed of what he has done, and then he finally admits the full extent of his misdeeds as he lays dying. It's an interesting conundrum. The original Boromir would have showcased the corruption of the One Ring on a much greater scale, a Prince of Gondor gradually succumbing to corruption until he's willing to side against his own people if it means claiming his birthright is a mighty downfall. But in the original plot outline, I think the tragedy of Boromir's character would be lost in how detestable he would become. It becomes much harder to sympathize with him at all because he's repeatedly an asshole, he repeatedly doubles down on his misdeeds, and then he ultimately succumbs to evil due to selfishness. A lot of the tragedy in Boromir's actual character is that he succumbs to evil momentarily because of a desire to protect, not due to selfish reasons. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you're interested in the background and drafting of the Lord of the Rings, you can find everything in books 6 to 9 of the History of Middle-earth. This bit about Boromir appears in book 7, The Treason of Isengard. If you're interested in another weird concept that Tolkien drafted, you can watch my video on Trotter, the time when Aragorn was a hobbit with wooden legs. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you ever lose track of something, just say it climbed a tree as an excuse.